It is really an honor to be here. I saw the list of your other speakers. You have had a great lecture series. I hope I don't disappoint. And I hope I am more of interest than that beautiful scenery you have out here. I don't want to catch anyone daydreaming and looking out there. So the topic today is America in a changing world order. And I'm coming to this topic from a very unique perspective. It's from 31 years working for USAID, a lot of that time overseas, and seeing what America can do overseas, and the rest of the time in Washington, working on national policy issues with the NSC or briefing Congress. And so I'd like to structure my comments into three main sections. First, a little bit about USAID. And in the Q&A, we can talk a lot about the current situation. And if you have any specific questions about that, happy to do that in the Q&A. But talk a little bit about USAID and why it's important. Then talk about this changing world order. What does it mean? And what does it mean in the context of today's global challenges? And finally, the third area, are we as the United States ready to engage in this new world order? So what is USAID? Now, many people had never heard of USAID until recently, right? It's been in the news a lot. And I think people who knew of it always knew about the humanitarian assistance that we provided, the life-saving assistance that saves lives post-earthquake or typhoon. But USAID also operates 80 missions overseas, helping countries improve their economic welfare, their governance, and overall well-being. But this development assistance, it's a lot more than American generosity. It's actually an instrument of national power. It's considered by policymakers to be one of the 3 Ds. The 3 Ds are how America projects its power. The D of defense, the D of diplomacy, and the D of development. So USAID in the federal government is classified as a national security agency. It just happens to have development in its name. A stable, prosperous world is in our national interest. It keeps us safe. It's essential for our well-being. Because of that, USAID officials work in the most challenging and dangerous environments in the world. In fact, 2/3 of the places where USAID officials work are in conflict or recovering from conflict. So USAID was involved in development projects across the globe, but its value to Americans was much more than that. USAID's vast global network and its world-class emergency response capability made it an important line of defense against pandemics coming to America, against agricultural diseases from wiping out our crops, about creating a stable world with less pressures for migration, about actually contributing to our own economic growth. For example, over the last 10 years, 2/3 of the growth in American exports came from major USAID countries. In fact, 11 out of 15 of our largest trading partners were recipients of foreign assistance. 95% of global consumers live outside the United States. USAID helps develop these markets so that they can thrive, so that we can trade, and that we can maintain access to international markets, which is essential to our prosperity and in the best interest of the American people. So, again, I'm coming to this topic with more than 3 decades of experience. And what that experience tells me is this key message to you tonight, which is the following. We are living in the most consequential time since World War II. The international structures and systems that have governed how the world operates during what has been called the American era are now being questioned. So The fundamental issue today is who will determine what the world will look like, and what is our ability to engage and help shape that. So to give it a little bit of perspective, let's walk through some of the shared history we all have together. First, what is the American era? Well, following World War II, as you all know, America became a global superpower and began shaping the institutions and international norms that govern world affairs, and people call this the American era. And as you all know, the Cold War dominated the first part of this American era. Global politics, economics, and institutions were all seen through the prism of this superpower competition. Our international relations were all defined by the Cold War. And for the United States, our security was threatened by the concentration of power in the Soviet Union. But this strategic context changed fundamentally with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War and the consolidation of the American era. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the demise of communism validated Western liberal ideas, democratic models, free market ideals, and again, consolidated American leadership. But this global context shifted once again in 9/11. I was actually deployed to Iraq. I was actually detailed to the Pentagon to set up pre-war planning for Iraq, and then was one of the first civilians in Baghdad during the war. And looking back at that time now, I realized that 9/11 was an inflection point for America. It fundamentally changed how we viewed the world. While during the Cold War, our security was threatened by the concentration of power, post 9/11, we realized it's the absence of power that was a security threat. It was fragile states, ungoverned spaces, and non-state actors who were threatening our security from these areas. And the impact of this change was substantial and dramatic. For example, we invested trillions and trillions of dollars in wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Pakistan, and across Northern Africa. So why do I mention these two periods? Cold War, post 9/11? Because changes in the global environment impact our security and our national well-being, and impact how we interact with the world. Now, once again, the global context is changing. It is the biggest shift since World War II. We are now experiencing a rapidly changing world order. This did not begin with the current administration. Not at all. But it is accelerating now, rapidly. We are at another inflection point that is redefining how the world works. So how would I describe this inflection point? Simply put, the 21st century is being shaped by the global ambitions of rising authoritarian powers. They seek to redefine the geopolitical and economic world order. They're seeking to upend the American era. And to do so, they need to promote distrust of the institutions and ideals of the 20th century that were championed by us and by our like-minded countries. They've even actively tried to persuade Americans to distrust and question our own democratic practices and institutions. And I think we've witnessed the effectiveness of Russian propaganda in our past election cycles. So the question is this, as I said earlier, the question is, who will decide what the world will look like? Now, authoritarian governments, they need a world that looks like them and that supports their version of governance. And because of that, I believe that the 21st century is being defined by a competition for ideas. And the ideas that are on the table are the next set of international norms and standards. For example, information use and access, and who can use it and how can they access it. Definitions of civil and political rights. What's considered good social behavior. And ultimately, and I think most frightening, what is open for discussion in this new changing world order is what is the relationship between citizen and state? See, authoritarian governments, most notably PRC China, are engaging in this competition of ideas to promote their national self-interest. And let me say this clearly, I'm a realist. Countries do that. They operate in their own self-interest. We certainly do and have. But there are crucial differences between the interests and values of authoritarian governments and more democratic ones. So, what are some of these examples of this changing world order? One is the Belt and Road Initiative, China's Belt and Road Initiative. That is stitching China closer to the world through investments in infrastructure projects. China has invested an unprecedented amount of funding in over 150 countries and is now reaping huge trade benefits from this. For example, last year, the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping inaugurated a new state-of-the-art deepwater port in Peru, extending China's influence deep into Latin America. Now, this high-tech logistical hub is being exclusively operated by China and can accommodate Chinese warships. The Belt and Road Initiative has fostered rapid growth in Chinese parastatals, which now almost always, 100% of the time, outcompete our corporations overseas. See, China's goal is to expand and develop export markets so they have alternatives to the more liberal world. And our current tariff policy furthers China in that direction. Investing in trade facilities gives the PRC control over key trade flows and control over who can benefit them and who cannot, what other countries can and cannot benefit from them. China is the largest creditor in the world now. It has now announced a huge billion-dollar investment in a new digital Silk Road, connecting countries on telecommunications and digital platforms. It's the leader in green technology. It's years, if not a decade ahead of us on that. And their development bank positions them as the lead in development. Their development bank rivals the World Bank. And at a time when the United States has slashed 83% of its development programs, we've ceded the space now to China. So not only has China recognized the importance of economic power, they also recognize the importance of soft power. For example, China uses education as a pillar for its engagement in Africa. In 2003, fewer than 2,000 African students were studying in China. A mere 13 years later, the number has ballooned to about 60,000, 26 times increase. And then just before the pandemic, if you look at all the international students in China, there was 500,000. Now, the United States is still the largest, has the largest international enrollment by far, bringing nearly $5 billion into the United States. But recent events are creating a sharp decline in that enrollment. In fact, over the past year, the enrollment has decreased by 130,000 students. And it is increasingly more and more difficult for international students to study in the United States. The administration has canceled 4,000 student visas of students already in the United States. And we're being perceived as being hostile to foreign students. So China, on the other hand, has recognized the need to attract the best and the brightest among the international students and then influence them in the next generation, influence this next generation of leaders and innovators. Soft power. China hosts the annual China-Africa Forum. So last year, 51 heads of state from Africa went to China, to Beijing. At a time when we are reducing our presence in Africa, we are eliminating investments, we are abandoning communities and businesses, and we're canceling agreements, China produced a myriad of agreements with over 50 African countries, and the Chinese Premier, Xi Jinping, made the commitment of allocating $50 billion to Africa over the next 3 years. Finally, China recognizes that to reshape the world, it needs to wield influence in key international organizations that set norms and standards, such as the International Telecommunications Union. Now, I've never heard of the International Telecommunications Union, so why would it be important? Why would the ITU be important? Why do we care? Well, the ITU sets standards for digital communication and networks, radio communications and systems, and satellite communication standards. These standards impact the ability of individual countries to sell their technology. And they also determine how that technology can be used. China now has considerable influence in the ITU Council. And because of that, it has established the global standards for 6G technology. And guess what? It is the leader in 6G research, the leader in standardization, the leader in patents on 6G. It has more than 2 times the number of patents the United States has in 6G technology. And is proposing protocols at the ITU which will enable countries to turn off the internet when they deem so. Why? Because China needs a world that looks like them. So one question in this changing world order is, what role do the BRICS play? Now, the BRICS, as some of you know, were originally composed of B, Brazil, and then Russia, India, China, and South Africa, BRIC. Well, they've increased in membership, and they represent now about 40% of the world's population. But it's traditionally been kind of weak. But now they are gaining strength. And they're positioning themselves as an alternative to Western-led institutions. One of their key policies is to advocate for a de-dollarization of the world economy to challenge Western financial dominance. Now, de-dollarization would have an immediate impact on every American. Because of its stability, because of the stability of the United States, many dollars are held overseas, trillions and trillions. In fact, 60% of all physical dollars are held outside the United States. De-dollarization would increase interest rates rapidly and inflation. And we would see our national debt payments skyrocket, leaving us less money in our budget to address other priorities. Now, the good news is there's still no alternative to the US dollar. It's not the Chinese yen, and it's not the European Union's currency either, the EU. But there is growing pressure for de-dollarization. And Putin has been a staunch advocate for de-dollarization. And he wishes to use the BRICS to end the power of the American dollar, a goal shared by China. And growing confidence of a Russian win in Ukraine and our growing indifference to Ukraine, because of that, Russia is being perceived as a more powerful global player and an alternative to the West. So this raises concerns and pressure for de-dollarization. In fact, last year, under the Biden administration, the Washington Post concluded, quote, "The BRICS have emerged as a powerful symbol of declining American prestige in the global South." Okay, now this isn't to say that authoritarian governments don't have fundamental problems and challenges. They do. China has struggled to recover from the pandemic. Last year, it barely hit 5% growth. Now, our growth in the last quarter was negative, so we'd take 5%. But for China, that's not a good thing. And the IMF believes that China will only grow by 4% this year and next year. Its aging population, its low birth rate, could also reduce its economic growth. And social cohesion in China is being tested now because of unemployment, particularly among the youth. So the PRC government is trying to address this and build social cohesion by appealing to nationalism. So, meanwhile, the United States remains the leader in several key areas: innovation, technology, finance, higher education. Although, frankly, current moves by this administration are eroding that leadership. The administration has slashed support for research and higher education, and nearly $8 billion in clean energy investments were turned off in the first quarter of 2025. So this is a very, very dangerous time. It's a very dangerous time. The U.S. is no longer viewed as a reliable international partner. Meanwhile, authoritarian governments are stoking platforms of nationalism to build their own social cohesion. This is a dangerous time. Now, this changing world order is taking place during another unique time that strategists call a period of polycrises. So it's not just one crisis that's going on. There are so many crises going on in the global system right now. It's unprecedented. And they are complex and numerous and interconnected. So that's why the term polycrises is used. So what are some of these challenges? How about conflict? There are more violent conflicts today in the world than in any time since World War II. 130 million people have been displaced. Massive amount of displacement. Increasing migration, increasing poverty, increasing instability. Debt. The world's level of debt has escalated quickly, has grown quickly to $315 trillion. Again, this is the largest, fastest, most widespread increase in debt since World War II. What does this mean? Approximately 3.3 billion people live in countries where debt servicing now takes priority over expenditures in health and education. Overall, we have seen progress in development globally stagnate since the mid-2010s, actually. Since the mid-2010s, the poor have been getting poorer compared to the wealthy. What does this mean? 700 million people are now classified as living in extreme poverty, and over 3 billion are classified as poor. Pandemics, another part of these polycrises. I mean, we all know about the COVID pandemic. It highlighted the weakness in international cooperation. The impact was devastating. For the first time since World War II, global life expectancy decreased. This was not our first pandemic, and it will not be our last. Climate change. I have seen the impact of climate change in the communities where I work overseas. Every farmer tells me that. They see it. And its impact, they're here, and the impacts are only going to be more severe. Communities around the world are experiencing severe drought, severe storms, severe weather events, fires. Climate change is now leading to food shortages. It is slowing gains in agricultural productivity. It is degrading the environment. It is driving migration and displacement. People are now moving into cities that can't manage them, and eventually moving to Europe and the United States. All of this is against a context of a democratic backsliding. Freedom House, which monitors the state of democracy in the world, announced last year in 2024 that, again, for the 19th consecutive year, there was global backsliding in democracy. In fact, in 2024, the breadth and depth of this backsliding was extensive. Political rights and civil liberties were diminished in 60 countries. Now, to resolve these challenges, we really need to ramp up international cooperation. But the bad news is that international organizations support for them is eroding. A Lancet report from last year during the Biden administration noted the scaffolding that upholds international cooperation appears flimsy and close to collapse. And the current administration is abandoning U.S. commitments to key international organizations, whether it be NATO or UN, or development banks, and you name it. So we have to ask ourselves, what kind of leadership do we need? What should we do about this? Again, we're at this very, very, very dangerous time. Sometimes when you have these periods, it can forge outstanding leadership. Sometimes it creates leaders. Are we ready? Can we rise to the challenge? I think first, we really need to be clear-eyed about where we are as a country. We are not the global leader, politically or economically, that we used to be. And we need to acknowledge that if we are going to address that issue. For example, I don't know, this might shock you, but we are not the economic partner of choice for most countries around the world. China is the top trading partner for more than 120 countries around the world. China, right? We are not the leading manufacturer in the world. China passed us in 2010. Our manufacturing sector, which is 15% of world output, is dependent upon Chinese imports. Chinese manufacturing, more than 30% of world output, is not dependent upon us. China produces 1 out of every 3 physical products in the world. They produce half of all the steel in the world is produced in China, all the smelted copper, all the rare earth minerals. Let me give you a more stark example. Global shipbuilding. I think it's a very strategic industry, one that's essential for our national security. China dominates global shipbuilding, building significantly more ships than the United States. So in 2023, China built over 1,700 ships. Compared to the United States, we built 5. Yeah, that's from VOA. According to Defense News, the United States' share of the global market of shipbuilding is 0.01%. And we're struggling even to hold on to that capacity. So this disparity raises concerns about national security, economic opportunities, and production of global power. At the same time, our debt has skyrocketed to the highest levels ever. 123% of our GDP. Our debt is 123% of our GDP, prompting warnings by the IMF, warnings that they usually give to developing countries. Well, what does that mean in comparison? In 2008, US debt was 64% of GDP. Today, 123% of GDP. So 17% of our budget is just on debt servicing, not even reducing the debt, just servicing, 17%, right? That's the 3rd largest budget item. What that means is we're less equipped to invest in our own economy, to address crises when they come up, pandemics, conflict. And under the current president's budget proposal that went to Congress, this debt will increase by more than $1 trillion, which again could fuel de-dollarization pressures, even great debt expenditure, a downward economic spiral. So just on May 5th, The Economist magazine wrote, the biggest challenge to dollar dominance comes from within, including America's unsustainable debt. Now, this is something that I thought about a lot, this next topic, and I really hope someone does research on this. I would love to know if there's any connection between America's shrinking middle class and our current political system and divides and fractures. So what I've seen over my past 3 decades with USAID is the structure of American society becoming more like the countries that I was working in. I'll give you an example. In 1971, 61% of Americans lived in the middle class. By 2023, that share had been reduced to 51%. So Americans are more apart financially than ever before in recent history. A better way of looking at this is with something the economists call the Gini coefficient. It's an economic variable. Now, the Gini coefficient measures income inequality in a country on a scale from 0 to 1. 0 is perfect equality. Everyone owns the same amount. 1, perfect inequality. One person owns everything. So the lower the number, more equality. In 1980, the United States Gini coefficient was 0.34. Today it's 0.41. That's a significant increase in inequality. So what does that mean? That means our income distribution today is similar to countries like Cameroon, Bolivia, Malaysia, Uruguay. Peru's income distribution is slightly better than ours. Our European partner countries are doing better. So while we're at 0.41, that's high in inequality. Netherlands is 0.26, Norway 0.28. The structure of our society is looking more and more like Mexico than Belgium. And I wonder if the shrinking middle class and this widening gap between the super wealthy and everyone else, is that contributing to the frustration and the polarization and fragmentation we see today in politics and society? I don't know the correlation. I hope there's some smart researchers who are going to look into that, because I think we have a structural problem in the United States which is leading to dysfunctional politics. Again, our global popularity has been waning. Our reputation took a big hit under the previous administration. Worldwide perception of the United States became negative in Europe for the first time because of our role in the Gaza war. The Economist concluded actually last year that, quote, "The Gaza war is hastening the broad realignment of global forces. American leadership is falling behind." Meanwhile, Russia and China are gaining popularity, and China now has a net positive view globally. So what should we do? I mean, this is dire and dramatic. What do we do? Here's what I would suggest. First, I think we need to focus internally. We need to clean our own house. We need to invest and bolster and expand the middle class. We need to revitalize our own democracy. And I think the place I would start is campaign finance reform. The top 50 donors provided more than $2.5 billion in finance in our most recent election. So 50 donors provided $2.5 billion in our last elections. And I was scratching my head because I know that, for example, Elon Musk provided almost $300 million, more than anybody else. The richest man in the world provides more money than anyone has ever provided to an election. And then he addresses the American people from the Oval Office saying how he's going to run the country. At what point are we becoming an oligarchy? At what point is our system being corrupted by the amount of money in it? I've always said that we have the best form of government that money can buy. So we need to restore confidence in our government and confidence in our democratic processes. And the influence of money in our system is undermining our system of checks and balances. And I can tell you from closed-door conversations with members of Congress, they all know what's right. But they're afraid to do what's right because they're fearful of acting, because they will fearful of facing a overwhelming wave of partisan campaign finance. I think another thing we should do, and economists might find this to be controversial, is I think we need an industrial policy. And it should be one that doesn't distort our economy as much, but we need to prioritize key sectors. And I think the Biden administration did some things wrong and some things right. One thing they did right was beginning to look at an industrial policy. And they were prioritizing investments in green technology. I think that was the right thing to do. That's been reversed since. But we need an industrial policy. If shipbuilding is critical to our national security, we need to consider what we need to do about that. And look, if we're going to use tariffs, let's be strategic. Let's use tariffs to divert and diversify supply chains away from authoritarian competitors. We should leverage our advantages rather than diminish them, particularly in technology, education, finance, and innovation. Now, looking externally, we are the guardians of the international financial system, the dollar system, right? We need to be more judicious in our stewardship of this global finance system. We use it many times to further our own political goals. And I think we overuse it and we do it excessively, and that will weaken global support for the existing financial system. I'll give you an example. When you're at the NSC and there's a foreign policy issue And the first thing, like a military coup somewhere, the first thing someone says is, let's use sanctions, let's sanction them. Okay. How many entities do you think we are currently under sanctions right now by the US government? Any guess how many entities are we've sanctioned right now, currently under sanctions? 12,000. So I think we've overused this tool. And it's going to come back to haunt us because it will drive support for an alternative to the American financial system. I don't think we should pursue a China containment policy. That's wrong. And we tried to do that with AI, and it backfired, and then they doubled their investments in AI, and look where they are now. I think instead we need to attract and keep researchers from around the world. We need to, I think, really prioritize economics in our engagement, particularly also in our development assistance. Our development assistance, and we can talk about this in the Q&A. I love to talk all about USAID in our Q&A. But USAID doesn't determine what the development priorities are. That's done by the Secretary of State and by Congress. And so many times there's a lot of special interest and our programs in many places reflect those special interests. And they're great. They're very generous things to do. So 80 or 90% of our funding in Africa is all based on health, mostly on HIV prevention. I would argue that our national security interests in Africa go far beyond HIV prevention. But there's little money for working with them to develop their export markets and trade, and the little money to help them on their democratic transitions and things like that. So I really think we need to bring more of an economic lens to our foreign policy, our diplomatic and development tools. We also need to offer viable and competitive alternatives to China, which we don't do. And we need to highlight the predatory practices that China has and shed light on them. We need to prioritize and revitalize our bilateral, multilateral engagement. We need to really engage with international organizations that are reshaping the global rules and norms. By walking away from this, we're allowing others to do that. And they will do that to benefit themselves at a cost to us. We should really work to build alliances to start addressing these poly crises that we talked about. So, in short, we are at the most pivotal time in our history since World War II. And how we navigate this period will have a lasting impact, not only for the United States, but also for the world. We're seeing an erosion of American leadership and a mounting pressure on the Western institutions that have governed world affairs since World War II, all during a time of poly-crises. Meanwhile, authoritarian governments are investing in and pushing for a new world order that benefits themselves. So we really need to focus on what is required now to compete and engage fully on these issues. So happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Talking about different countries and their influence, what about individuals such as Elon Musk and Starlink? There was an article recently, I believe it was in The Atlantic, about him potentially controlling the world in internet. And apparently that's being used by India and some African countries to gain favor with the Trump administration in regards to their dealing with tariff lowering.
Right. Yeah, you're right. In fact, I read an article recently that not only India, but Vietnam and many other countries where negotiations with Starlink had stalled in the past, now they're moving forward. I think that, and I'm not saying this is in the press, I think that the goal of Elon Musk is to diminish the administrative state. And that's, if you are a wealthy person, I think that's one of the things you would like, to have less restraints on the growth of your industry. And I think that's behind many things. I mean, it's not just Elon Musk. You remember Bezos and the Washington Post. The Washington Post, for the first year in a long time, didn't endorse a candidate, right? So I think you see the influence of money in our political system. And then those who have the money can affect the government in a way that benefits their businesses.
You really like your points, including the concern about money in the election process. It just is such a big problem. But the thing I wanted to ask you, because of your wisdom, is what do you think we should be doing about Ukraine, and what should we do about Gaza?
Right. Yeah, right. Well, like President Trump said, he's going to fix that in a day, right? So I'll tell you my fix in a day solution. So I think that we had a very weak foreign policy in the previous administration, and I think both of them, Gaza and Ukraine and Afghanistan, were low points. The Afghanistan withdrawal was an extremely low point. I think in Ukraine, my personal opinion was just enough assistance to fail. I think we were intimidated. I think we blinked. I think if it were the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy did not blink. But I think that we blinked. And because of that, I think Ukraine is in a worse place today. The impact of Gaza is huge, not only on American leadership, but also on norms of humanitarian assistance, which are now going back decades. There was consensus in the world that food could not be used as a weapon, consensus that relief workers would not be targeted. And so all those things have been cast aside, and the world also blames us for that. There was an article today, it was in the Washington Post, about the cost of the pier that was built, right? And I think it was $250 million or $500 million, and it didn't work. And the reason we built the pier was because Israel wouldn't allow food access to go through the gates. And the world says, but Israel, the largest recipient of foreign assistance, and come on, guys, really? So I think that Gaza made us look weak, but more importantly we abandoned negotiated humanitarian assistance principles that will come back and haunt us in the next conflict. Because people can say, look what happened in Gaza. Now we can do this. We can do it, whether it's Ethiopia and Tigray or the next conflict. Yeah. So what to do, right? So Ukraine, well, in hindsight, I would have provided greater weapons earlier on. In Gaza, I mean, what to do about Gaza? No one's been able to address the Middle East crisis since 1948, right? I think that I would have used more of our political leverage. I think that our Gaza policy was dictated by Netanyahu, and I don't think I would not have allowed that to happen. I think we had more influence over that situation. I would have pushed such that the humanitarian assistance principles would not have been eroded, that there would have been hopefully less loss of life. But solving the overall Middle East peace process, I don't have an easy answer on that one.
Question over here.
With all your wonderful knowledge and wisdom and experience, what's next on your journey to help bring about positive change for our country?
Great question. Right now, what I'm focused on is helping my colleagues at USAID. I retired from USAID in 2021, late 2021. And the community is mobilizing to help all the USAID employees. So USAID had 13,000 employees, of which 4,000 were we call direct hires. The rest were contractors, and 5,000 were overseas workers from the countries where we work. Very, very dedicated. And these are people, for example, when I worked in Zimbabwe, our local staff were the ones who were pushing for democracy in Zimbabwe. Now that they're being fired, they won't have the protection of the US Embassy behind them. They're going to be targets. This will happen in many countries around the world. So we are turning our backs on people who helped our country, right? What we're doing is we're mobilizing a lot of support for these families, for the families that are returning from overseas who now are facing financial ruin. They may have a house to go back to if it's rented out. They have, but as I explained earlier, their possessions they'll have to leave their possessions behind. Eventually their possessions will catch up with them. But they're going to arrive back in the States with suitcases and children, and they'll have to get them in school, and they'll need living supplies. They may need a place to stay. So the entire community is working on the physical needs. The community is also working to see if we can do job training, because the entire development sector is gone. It's gone. You can't say, okay, I lost my job at USAID. I'm now going to work for CARE, Save the Children. I'm going to go work. No, that's all gone because there's no more money. So these are people who are highly trained who have to reinvent themselves. When I say highly trained, USAID had the highest education level of any federal agency, more than NASA. And that took decades to build, because as we were talking, monitoring drought and fused networks, the skill set you need to engage in development issues are ranging from epidemiologists to economists, to governance officials and conflict people. You get, the best thing about USAID is sitting around a table and listening to these conversations about worldwide experts who have devoted their lives to something. And then you bring it all together and focus it on a problem. That's gone. And these people now have nowhere to go. So we're focusing on job training, and if there's financial assistance we can provide. We're also focusing on counseling, because they're traumatized. What do you tell your children? You've lost your job, you lost your career. And so it's a very, very difficult time for employees. So what I'm doing now is that I also do a lot of media outreach and work. The recent media work I was doing was talking about the Burma earthquake, because I opened our USAID mission in Burma. And just very briefly, the United States has the most effective urban search and rescue. If there is an earthquake anywhere, we have the best, most technical, skilled teams that can arrive immediately and go anywhere in the world and start digging people out of rubble, finding them and saving lives. And you only have 72 hours up to 5 days to do that, right? Then the window's shut. So we maintain contracts with urban search and rescue teams in Fairfax County, Virginia, and also LA County, California, so we can deploy them globally as quickly as possible. The current administration slashed 83% of all USAID contracts. They promised they wouldn't slash humanitarian assistance contracts. They have. They didn't. They put the urban search and rescue team's contract back in place. But what they didn't put in place was the logistics contract to move them. So we had paid for people sitting in LA and Virginia who could have been in Burma, who could have been digging people out of rubble. When there was an earthquake in Turkey, we had 160 urban search and rescue people there, and an overall team of 200 people with other specialists in nutrition and shelter helping. This is what we do as the United States. And because of it, there's no stronger brand than the American flag pulling people out of rubble. I mean, what that does for us internationally, the goodwill that buys us. So we weren't there. We eventually, a week later, sent 3 people to Burma, and they were fired when they were there through incompetent. That's just, yeah. And we also maintain warehouses full of relief supplies, emergency relief supplies. We keep them all over the world, Dubai, Malaysia, so we can move them instantly, because time isn't critical. Right? And this is food, this is plastic tarps, this is jerry cans for water, this is cooking stuff. Without the logistics contract, that stuff's just gathering dust. Bought and paid for by all of us, gathering dust, not helping people. So what I was doing was also highlighting and exposing that, because here's the thing. If there's an earthquake tomorrow in Haiti, we can't do anything. We can't do anything. We have wiped out that capacity. What does that mean? Many Haitians will die. And then we can't come in afterwards and help them rebuild or recover. What does that mean? Disease, second wave of death. What does that mean? Haitians coming to Miami, right? In 2010, that was a massive earthquake, and I was the lead for the entire U.S. government in responding to that earthquake. 1.4 million people were left homeless. Not one of them came to the United States because of our capacity to provide food and water and shelter and security. We also had the U.S. military there to provide security, right? But we don't have that anymore. And so I also want to highlight, this is my last point, this isn't about USAID, it's about the U.S. government and this tool of development. Whether it exists at state or wherever, fine. But this is what I want to highlight. What we're losing to ourselves by losing this tool of development.
Well, you raise a lot of interesting issues. And I have a lot of questions. No, I'm only kidding. China. The thing that I think China, Russia, Iran, and I shouldn't say this, aren't the fact that China, Russia, and Iran doing what the United States and the West did after World War II, they're emulating us or imitating us, where we're driving away our allies. Mm-hmm. They're doing it. And the fact that China has 1.4 billion, 4 times the United States, I mean, doing what Trump's doing, excuse me for bringing up politics, but it isn't the solution. I mean, basically what he's telling us is your standard of living is going down.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're walking away from the playing field is what we're doing. And we're ceding that area. In the 2026 budget proposal by Trump to Congress, slashes the State Department, diplomatic and also development, by 84%, right? And takes us out of international organizations. So we are walking away from the playing field. And since we know China's strategy is to influence international organizations, and we're walking away from it, we are only accelerating this changing world order. And you can't get it back. You can't, once it's there, it's there. So yeah, and you're right, they're taking it out of the playbook of what we did at post-World War II. Post-World War II, we were the largest creditor nation, we were the largest manufacturing nation, we were the largest trading nation, right? That had already shifted previous to this administration. So it was already moving that way, and instead of focusing on things we needed to focus on more strategically, I think what we're doing is we're just walking away. And I understand also 2 other things. I think that the foreign policy, if you have to brand the foreign policy for this administration, I would use the word transactional. Give me this, give me that. Always under Republican and Democratic administrations, it was a value-based foreign policy. Now, we didn't always do that, right? But that's the cloak we put on it. Values-based, right? This is more just transactional. And it's also spheres of influence. We're receding key areas. We're saying, okay, this is Ukraine, not so much, we don't care about so much. We're ceding key areas to others and again, walking away from the playing field.
So do you think we'll ever recover?
I really think, going back to, if I had a magic wand, I would really go back and again focus in on ourselves. We really need to address the middle class. I know many people, and perhaps you do as well, who are working 3 jobs, who are wondering how they're going to get their kids through college, college costs today, who can't access health care. And so here's the other thing. I think that the middle class, which is shrinking, has also been kept artificially affluent by the cheap cost of Chinese imports, right? Remember flat screen TVs used to cost like $15,000, and now they're like $300, and now people put them on the front doorstep to say, please take this, right? So the cost of things has gotten very cheap. And I think that has artificially kept the standard of living for the middle class up. But now they're really feeling squeezed. And I think what they want is action. And I think when someone says, I will do this, I am action, I think they'll say, yes, great, action, we want that. So I think when we recover, we got to go and look at the structural problems we have inside our country. And one is the shrinking middle class, which has been shrinking under Democratic and Republican administrations. And then the issue of restoring our own democracy, I think, is critical to our national well-being. I think once you do that, then you can start addressing the other issues.
I wonder if you would share your perspective on how Bitcoin may contribute to de-dollarization.
Yeah, I don't know enough about that. I mean, but I know this, that the reason there hasn't been a rapid de-dollarization is that there's really no alternative. Besides that quote I read to you, the economists had a whole issue on de-dollarization, I think it was 2 weeks ago, right? And they basically concluded there really is no real alternative yet, so they might go to more of a basket of currencies. If Bitcoin, which I confess I'm not an expert on, becomes an alternative, right? If if there is something that becomes a real alternative, then I think we will see a de-dollarization. And again, that would result in a spike in interest rates and an increase in our national debt.
With all the cutback in research dollars, it seems like we really are going to have a brain drain of all of our scientists going to other countries. Is there any talk about that in D.C.?
I'm sure there's talk about that. I'm not in those circles. I think that one, we're not, there's the brain drain, and we're not even being the brain sponge, if you will, that we always were attracting the best and the brightest. And will they go to China? Probably they'll go to Germany. Probably go to Europe. And if I were one of those countries, I would be giving every incentive possible to capture them. So not only are we not attracting the best talent, but I think there could be the brain drain because of the slash in research. Sir. Now, remember, Congress is the one that sets the budget. And Congress can take the budget proposal and actually restore those funds. What has happened in this administration is they've refused to spend those funds, which is unconstitutional. And normally Congress would say, we're Congress, we're independent, how dare you? But they're not doing that. So, yeah.
Basically, if it's unconstitutional and it's illegal, so how does that, what's happening to people?
Right.
I mean, it's an executive order, it's not really,
Right.
it's not, the funding doesn't come from the president, it comes from
Right.
Is there something happening in the courts?
A lot is happening in the courts. There are so many court cases. But a lot of them say, great, this is unconstitutional, but we're going to enforce that. It's up to Congress to enforce it. And Congress goes, well, gee, I don't know. So there's been I can personally been aware of 10, with respect to USAID, there are multiple legal challenges.
It just takes time to get through the system.
Yeah, and a lot of them were temporary restraining orders and things like that. And Congress was trying to, the judiciary system was trying to slow it down. I mean, you saw, okay, the case of the individual who's extradited to Guatemala. What did the court say? Unconstitutional. What does the administration say? So, yeah. Yeah. So that I think you're seeing across the board.
Okay. From our discussion before, this is definitely a USAID question. With my years working on contracts with them, not for them, since this all happened, I've been very cut off from what's happened. Our international offices are down to the bare minimum, and the project people, are basically gone. Are there any programs out there that are being helped? Meaning, are other countries taking over something?
Yeah. So they canceled 83% of all programs, right? They are going to take the rest and have the State Department administer them, but the State Department doesn't have the financial systems, the skill sets, the processes, right? China has, in a few cases, offered to come in with the investment funding in Latin America to finish these projects that we are walking away from, but not all of them. Most of them are just stopping. And the USAID Inspector General early on said, whoa, you are stopping, and they focused just on humanitarian assistance. It's just focused on $8 billion in humanitarian assistance. Now, because you're telling USAID people to walk off the job, we don't know where this money is going. No one is safeguarding it. The warehouses, the assets, this is a vulnerability. So he pointed this out, and he was fired the next day. Yeah, Independent Inspector General.
The people who depended on this work, are they getting help?
No. All right. No, the cost in human life is enormous. So where there's the recipient of assistance, like if you are in a refugee camp in Sudan and USAID was providing funding to run the water pumps, there's no water, right? The food rations are going down, right? If you were dependent upon tuberculosis medicine, you're not getting it Why do we care about that? Because drug-resistant tuberculosis would be a very scary thing in the United States. One of the things USAID did, not people know about this, there is a disease called rust, which wipes out wheat. The international community thought we had gotten rid of rust in the 50s, right? It came up again in Africa. So what did USAID did? We worked together, we alerted and worked together with the Department of Agriculture and key agricultural research institutions around the world to develop rust-resistant wheat strains and then contain the spread of the rust by having rust-resistant wheat strains and then provide the same seeds to American farmers, right? So billions and billions of dollars of wheat was preserved in the United States because if you ask what does a world without USAID look like, it's a world where pandemics come to America. I was in Madagascar. Now, I don't think you know this, but every year Madagascar has a plague outbreak. It sounds very medieval. When I was there, the plague mutated to pneumonic plague. Yeah. And so we were leading the international effort to lock down and control and get rid of pneumonic plague. If that pneumonic plague had gotten on a plane to the United States, no, it didn't. Ebola outbreaks all the time. USAID is on the forefront in West Africa, making sure Ebola doesn't come. So a world without USAID means more pandemics back home. It means a poorer America. We export $2 billion of American agricultural products, $1 billion in pharmaceutical products, right? We create export markets that I mentioned in my speech. One program alone called Prosper Africa, which was launched during the first Trump administration and then canceled under the second one, created $130 billion worth of exports between America and Africa, right? Doing what the Chinese do, creating markets and good stuff like that, canceled. So it's a poorer America, it's a less healthy America. It's one where there's less democracy, there's more crises, there's more migrants coming to America, pushing on our borders because they're desperate. And it's one where we have walked away and ceded the playing space to China. Yes.
So you just raised an interesting point. So what happens with all these pandemics, the lack of the scientific foundation for stopping these plagues and the destruction of wheat crops? I mean, what happens to the world? Will there be food? Because at some point it sounds like it will just all sort of blow up, you know, like volcanic ash.
Yeah.
And where will the food come from? What will happen to the food supplies if these things are getting to our country or we're sending them elsewhere?
It's an excellent question because it's not just that, it's the impact of climate change. It's the impact of record levels of conflict. Farmers can't plant crops if there's conflict going on. And so, as I said, the world is entering a very, very scary phase. And when we go through these transitions, there's usually more conflict, right? So I'm very concerned. And the drivers of food insecurity are not just the fact that it's more diseases and pests, but conflict and climate change and scarce water, right? And we're seeing all of that. And at the same time, we're seeing less monitoring of it. As your colleague was saying, she was running a monitoring system. What's been dismantled was a lot of our surveillance of what's going on in the world. So USAID used to monitor bird flu around the world. That doesn't exist, it's gone. We're not monitoring anymore. And bird flu's come to the United States, by the way. USAID stopped swine flu from coming to the United States. Now we're not even monitoring it. So it's kind of a scary time.
So since information and the transmission of understanding through information is so important, I'm wondering if you're able to get on any programs on the right, like Fox News, so that we are all on your side, but there's so many people in the United States who cognitively just are not exposed to this information. And I'm wondering what kind of inroads you think might be helpful in that regard.
It's something I need to do. I need to have the courage to do it, frankly. But absolutely, I think it's hard when you're competing against misinformation that comes directly from the White House. When the president is saying that USAID is buying condoms for Gaza, which we don't do, turns out there is a province in Mozambique called Gaza with a very high HIV rate. Yes, we bought condoms for Gaza. Mozambique, right? But already the damage is done. And when the president says that the condoms we bought for Gaza, Palestine, were used to make balloons to bomb Israelis, and everyone believes him, it's really hard. But I acknowledge I need to have the courage to take that step.
Well, and all of your compatriots, everybody needs to be working really hard to get in the media
Right.
on the right.
It's true. And get into the blogs like that.
You have a question in the back.
It's two-pronged. Do you see, let's say at the midterms, there's a change in Congress. Do you feel that the Democrats are going to be willing to step up on this? And how, and the second part is, how do you envision unrolling this in the future?
Right. So 2 questions, good questions. You know, I think I would hope that if the Democrats get one of the houses in the midterms, that they show strong leadership. I would hope. I haven't seen it yet, quite frankly. I think the Democrats need to put out their plan, their vision, right? Okay, USAID is being dismantled, and the State Department is being. State Department, they just told they're going to fire 3,000 people at the State Department at a time when we need to engage in the world, right? They're next, Peace Corps, bye-bye, USIP, gone. Wilson Institute, gone. So I think the Democrats need to say, this is our vision of the United States. This is our vision of the assets we need. And have a debate. But they're not projecting that at all. I mean, the Republicans had Project 2025, right? But they said it, there it is, and they're doing what they said they were going to do. Where is the vision on the other side? I think Americans need a choice. And instead, they see action and activity on one side, and quite frankly, complacence on the other, right? And so hopefully they will organize and come together and have a strong vision. I would love to be optimistic and believe that USAID could be reconstituted, or the development function. My understanding is that the people who are dismantling it are doing it in such a way that it can never be reconstructed. So if I take this glass and I throw it against that wall, it shatters into 1,000 pieces. And you say, Chris, put that glass back together. I can't do that. So how are they doing that? They could do a lift and shift. They could say, this is a development function, and it needs to be in the State Department. Move it over. Okay, it's in the State Department. Done. And that capacity still exists. Instead, what they're doing is they're taking the capacity and they're scattering it around the State Department. So humanitarian assistance is a function we have in one bureau in USAID, right? So it's organized and unified with a global response. They're going to take that and they're going to scatter it among all the different regional bureaus in the State Department, right? Every little bureau gets a little piece of that. Development is a discipline. It requires systems, strategic thinking, processes, plans. I mean, we have a whole thing called the program cycle where you do a strategic analysis. Like, that's all gone. So if you get rid of the people, that enormous capacity, and they're all gone. And you get rid of the processes, they're all gone. And the structure, I don't think they're going to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I think it's too late for USAID. I don't think it's too late for other institutions, other parts of the U.S. government, and I'm more optimistic for them. We were the first ones that, quote, were fed to the wood chipper, remember that quote? And I think because we're an easy target, we don't have a domestic constituency. USAID is notoriously bad for communicating in clear English to the American people about what we do and why it's important. We just don't have that capability. And then you have all this misinformation. Were we sponsoring Sesame Street in Egypt? Absolutely. Why? Egyptians have a high illiteracy rate. They get a lot of information from extremist mullahs. Sesame Street was teaching religious tolerance. If you are a Christian minority, a Coptic minority in Egypt, you would thank God for Sesame Street, right? So you could take whatever you want and spin it up, and there was a lot of misinformation that was being gone out there. And so I think we were the first target, an easy target, and I think maybe too late for USAID, hopefully not too late for these other institutions.
Mine's real easy. What proportion of the U.S. budget is USAID? Great.
Thank you. So, yeah, less than 1% for the entire foreign affairs budget. And USAID's portion of that is less than 0.5%. And I've been told this, you can look it up, but it's a good soundbite if it's true. What does that mean for everyday Americans? That means everyday Americans' tax burden for USAID is $36. I spent more than that on a haircut today. Right? And think of what we get for that. You know, pandemic relief and prestige overseas and export markets and all the goodwill. Yeah, so if you want to save federal dollars, you're not really saving any federal dollars by going over less than 0.5%. And you're actually going to cost a lot more because, I'll say it this way, the U.S. military is our biggest supporter. Whenever we have budget cuts, we have former generals and admirals write to Congress and lobby on our behalf. And that's because I've worked very closely with the military. And they know it's cheaper to send in USAID before a problem than have to send U.S. troops and lose lives. And so we were like brother, sister organizations, and they really support what we do. Because that less than 0.5%, you know, the multiplier of that is enormous.
We want to thank Chris Milligan for closing out our 2024-25 season.
Thank you.